The first light of dawn stretched across the surface of Pine Ridge Lake, the water shimmering with a golden glow that seemed to breathe life into the sleepy shoreline. The air smelled crisp, mingling pine resin with the cool dampness of morning mist. A pair of loons floated near the reeds, their gentle calls echoing across the still water, as if welcoming the day. At the far edge of the lake stood a weathered log cabin, its cedar beams darkened by time and softened by countless winters. It wasn't grand or modern like the polished vacation homes dotting the other side of the lake, but it had soul, and for its owner, that soul was worth more than any architect's blueprint or developer's vision. The cabin had stood there for nearly 60 years, first built by the protagonist's grandfather with nothing more than his hands, a borrowed saw, and the stubborn determination to create a retreat away from city noise. Every creak of the floorboards, every nail hammered into the beams, carried a legacy. For Daniel Carter, a man in his late 40s with quiet eyes and the kind of patient strength that only comes from years of building things with his hands, the cabin wasn't just property. It was memory, heritage, and sanctuary all woven together. He remembered fishing at dawn with his father on this very lake, sitting by the stone fireplace with his mother during thunderstorms, and even carving his initials into the railing of the porch one reckless summer. Now, decades later, he found peace in watching the sunrise from that same porch, coffee steaming in his hand, the lake alive with morning light. The cabin wasn't a luxury investment to him. It was home, whether he spent weekends there or long summers away from the noise of town. More importantly, it was his land, legally, rightfully, undeniably his. At least, that's what he believed. The tranquility of that morning was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming shut near the gravel path leading to the cabin. Daniel frowned, setting his mug on the railing, and stood. A cluster of well-dressed figures emerged from a shiny SUV that looked completely out of place among the dirt tracks and pine trees. At their front was a woman in her mid-50s, stiff blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her heels clicked against the uneven ground as though she thought the forest floor ought to obey her stride. Karen Whitfield, president of the Pine Ridge Lake Homeowners Association, had arrived. Daniel knew of her. Everyone did. She was infamous for her ruthless enforcement of community standards, whether it was the shade of paint on a mailbox or the angle of someone's deck chair. Behind her trailed two other board members, smug, stiff-backed men in polo shirts, and a young assistant carrying rolled-up maps. Karen approached the porch without so much as a greeting, already pointing her pen like a dagger toward the cabin. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice sharp with authority she had not been granted, "we need to have a serious discussion about this structure." Her lips curled slightly on the last word, as though the cabin were some diseased growth marring her perfect vision of the lake. Daniel crossed his arms, saying nothing at first, letting silence answer where words would be wasted. She continued, unfazed. "You're aware the association has been working on a new development plan for the community. Modern amenities, increased property values, a proper recreation center. That's the direction we're moving. And frankly, your cabin doesn't fit." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't fit what?" "The woods. The lake. My own land." His voice was calm, but his gaze stayed locked on her. She flinched slightly, but pressed on. "It doesn't fit the vision," she said, as though that explained everything. Her companions nodded dutifully, one of them chiming in about progress and aesthetic consistency. Karen stepped closer, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "Now, we've had discussions with the board. We'd like to make you an offer. The association is prepared to purchase this land from you, generously, I might add, so we can move forward. We can't have eyesores dragging down the value of the community." She said it casually, as if she were doing him a favor, as though his memories and legacy could be measured in dollars and signatures. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Daniel let out a slow breath through his nose, then descended the steps of the porch to stand on level ground with her. "This cabin has stood here longer than your HOA, longer than most of those lakefront mansions," he said, gesturing across the water. "My grandfather built it. My family bled into the soil here. It's not for sale. Not today. Not ever." His tone was firm, final, but not angry, the kind of voice that leaves no room for bargaining. Karen's smile tightened into a thin line. The men behind her shifted, uncomfortable, but she held her ground. "You'll regret being stubborn," she said softly, almost like a threat wrapped in silk. Progress can't be stopped, Mr. Carter. You'll see. With that, she turned sharply, heels clicking back toward her SUV, her entourage following. Daniel stood still, watching them go, a pit forming in his stomach. He didn't know yet what lengths they'd go to, but he could already feel the storm gathering over the lake. The week after Karen's unannounced visit, Daniel tried to push the encounter out of his mind. Life at the cabin carried its familiar rhythm, mornings of mist lifting off the lake, afternoons spent repairing the dock, evenings where the fire crackled as he thumbed through old books. Yet something gnawed at the edges of his peace. He noticed orange flags staked in the soil near the road, small neon squares fluttering against the wind like intruders. At first he thought they were random markers left by hunters or utility workers, but by the third day, surveyor tape crisscrossed the edge of his land, stretching in bright plastic ribbons that carved imaginary lines through the woods. Daniel's unease turned to suspicion when he saw a pair of men with clipboards pacing the boundary with measuring wheels, jotting notes, their reflective vests catching sunlight like signals. He strode down to confront them, asking what they were doing. They only shrugged, muttered something about HOA project approvals, and drove off in a white pickup before he could press them further. 2 nights later, Daniel attended the monthly HOA meeting, held in the glass-paneled community center on the opposite shore. The room was full, homeowners chatting, sipping coffee, flipping through agenda packets. Karen presided at the front like a queen at her court, her clipboard replaced tonight with a sleek leather folder. When Daniel walked in, heads turned, some neighbors nodding politely, others whispering behind their hands. Everyone knew the cabin. Everyone knew the man who refused to sell. As the meeting rolled on through mundane topics, parking restrictions, landscaping rules, the annual lake cleanup, Daniel waited, simmering. And then it came. Karen tapped her microphone and spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. As many of you are aware, the association is moving forward with a much-needed improvement to our community, a recreational complex by the lake. We're talking about a modern clubhouse, fitness center, indoor pool, even tennis courts. This project will increase property values across the board and bring Pine Ridge into the future. Applause broke out, the room buzzing with excitement. Karen smiled, feeding off the approval. Then her voice dropped slightly, growing sharp. Unfortunately, there is one obstacle. An outdated, privately owned cabin sitting directly in the path of our development plans. She didn't need to name Daniel, every eye in the room turned toward him. Daniel stood, his chair scraping the floor. That outdated cabin, he said evenly, is my family's home. And it's not in your jurisdiction. I have the deed. I own the land outright. The HOA doesn't dictate what I do on my property. A murmur rippled through the room, some neighbors shifting uncomfortably, others smirking at the drama. Karen leaned forward, her lips curling into a smile too polished to be genuine. Mr. Carter, no one is denying you own your little cabin, she said, emphasizing the word like a blemish. But ownership doesn't exempt you from progress. This community thrives on order and shared vision. Sometimes that requires sacrifice from individuals for the greater good. Her allies on the board nodded in unison, parroting her words. Anger rose in Daniel's chest, but he kept his voice measured. Sacrifice is one thing. Theft is another. I'm not selling. I'm not moving. And I'll fight anyone who tries to tell me otherwise. His words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. The room fell into silence, broken only by the scratch of Karen's pen as she jotted something in her folder. So noted, she said coolly. But you should know, Mr. Carter, the association has broad authority to enforce community standards and protect collective interests. You may find your position less secure than you imagine. Her eyes locked with his, cold and calculating. It wasn't a threat she shouted, but one whispered, the kind that lingered long after the meeting adjourned. Afterward, as neighbors trickled out, Daniel overheard whispers. Some sympathized quietly, it's wrong what they're doing. Others dismissed him, why cling to an old shack when progress is coming? A few avoided his eyes altogether. Karen swept past him without a glance, her perfume hanging in the air like smoke. He stood outside under the harsh glow of the parking lot lights, watching as board members clustered around their SUVs, laughing and congratulating themselves. He could see it in their faces, they thought they'd already won. That night, back at the cabin, Daniel sat by the cold fireplace long after midnight, the silence pressing heavy against the windows. He unfolded the yellowed deed papers his father had handed him years ago, tracing the ink with his thumb. The land was his. The cabin was his. But the HOA wasn't bluffing. He could feel them tightening their net, convinced they had power over him. What unsettled him most wasn't their arrogance. It was the nagging thought that they might actually try something reckless. The following morning confirmed his fears. As Daniel walked the perimeter of his land, he found fresh stakes driven deeper into the soil, bright orange paint sprayed across the ground in giant letters, Community Center, Phase 1. His heart pounded. They weren't waiting. They weren't negotiating. They were moving forward as if he didn't exist. Daniel stood among the markings, fists clenched, his breath visible in the cool air. The message was clear. The HOA wasn't going to back down. They were declaring war, and the cabin at Pine Ridge Lake was ground zero. The rumble came before the sun did. Daniel woke to the vibration rattling through the cabin floor, a low mechanical growl that didn't belong to the forest. At first he thought it was thunder rolling across the mountains, but as he threw on his boots and stepped onto the porch, the sound sharpened into the grinding roar of heavy machinery. The air was still foggy, the lake shrouded in silver mist, but beyond the tree line came the unmistakable clatter of engines and metal treads chewing into gravel. Daniel's heart dropped. He sprinted down the dirt path that curved toward the main road, and the sight waiting for him turned his stomach. 2 bulldozers, 3 trucks full of equipment, and a swarm of construction workers in hard hats, all clustered at the edge of his property. Behind them stood Karen and several HOA board members, arms crossed, clipboards in hand, faces smug with victory before the battle had even begun. "Stop!" Daniel shouted, his voice echoing off the still water. He broke into a run, boots crunching against the soil, his breath sharp in the morning chill. Workers looked up, some hesitating as he approached. He barreled into the clearing, placing himself squarely in front of the lead bulldozer, which idled like a beast waiting for command. "This is private land," he yelled, his voice raw with fury. "You can't set foot here, let alone tear anything down. I own this property. I have the deed right inside my cabin. Get off my land." He pointed toward the cabin standing proud behind him, its weathered logs glowing faintly gold in the dawn. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the hiss of hydraulic brakes and the call of a crow overhead. Karen stepped forward, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, her sunglasses flashing. She raised a sheet of paper high, shaking it like a banner. "Mr. Carter," she called out with rehearsed authority, "the association has approved permits for community development along this shore. This project has been green-lit, and your cabin is an obstruction to progress. You've been warned. You had your chance to cooperate." She turned, gesturing at the workers. "Proceed." Her voice was smooth but sharp enough to cut stone. Daniel's chest tightened, disbelief giving way to rage. "That's a fraud," he balked, striding toward her. "Those papers don't mean a damn thing. You don't own this land. You have no authority here." He pulled the folded deed from his pocket, thrusting it in her direction. But Karen only gave a thin, dismissive smile, as though he were a child waving a crayon drawing. The bulldozer's engine roared louder, drowning out Daniel's words. The operator, avoiding Daniel's eyes, shifted gears. Gravel churned under the machine's weight as it lurched forward. Daniel planted himself in its path, arms spread wide. "Don't you dare!" he shouted, his voice cracking from the strain. For a moment, the operator hesitated, hands frozen on the levers. A tense silence stretched between them, the man in the machine and the man before it, one bound by orders, the other by legacy. Karen's voice cut through the fog. "If he doesn't move, call security. We're not stopping for one stubborn man." The board members behind her chuckled, jotting notes, already envisioning their shiny clubhouse standing where the cabin did. Daniel backed away, fury and desperation warring inside him, as workers began hauling equipment toward the porch. Chains clanked, hammers swung, voices barked orders. The first bulldozer veered, angling toward the side of the cabin. Daniel's throat went dry. He could only watch as the machine pressed forward, its massive blade slicing into the earth, tearing roots and soil like paper. Then it struck. The sound was deafening, timber groaning, glass shattering, the porch railing snapping like kindling beneath the blade. Daniel shouted, sprinting toward the cabin, but 2 security guards intercepted him, blocking his path. He thrashed against them, his fists clenched, his voice hoarse with rage and heartbreak. "That's my home. You're destroying my home." But the bulldozer didn't care. It roared onward, plowing into the wall with brute force. Logs splintered, the roof sagged, and with each crash, a lifetime of memories crumbled into dust. Neighbors had gathered by then, drawn by the noise, standing in stunned silence along the road. Some gasped, hands covering their mouths, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Others whispered nervously, afraid to get involved. A few shook their heads, muttering about how the HOA had gone too far, but none stepped forward. The destruction was swift and merciless. Within the hour, the cabin was reduced to a heap of broken wood, shattered glass, and dust rising into the morning sky. Daniel broke free from the guards at last and stumbled toward the wreckage, falling to his knees in the dirt. His chest heaved, his eyes burning as he stared at the ruins of his family's legacy. His father's carved rocking chair, splintered beyond repair. The stone hearth, toppled into rubble. His mother's curtains, torn and buried under debris. Karen approached slowly, arms folded, her expression one of cool satisfaction. "You'll thank us one day, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This community deserves better than a relic from the past." Daniel lifted his head, dirt smudging his face, eyes blazing with something sharper than grief. He didn't answer her. Not then. Not while his home smoldered in ruin behind him and her laughter carried over the wreckage. But inside, beneath the ache, something solid and immovable began to form. A vow. This wasn't over. They thought they had broken him, that bulldozers could erase history, that papers and signatures could rob him of his land. But they were wrong. Karen and her board had no idea what line they had crossed. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly, his voice low but steady, cutting through the air like a blade. Then he turned, walking away from the wreckage, the ruins of his cabin smoldering behind him, already plotting the reckoning that was to come. The HOA boardroom buzzed with the hum of voices and clinking glasses, a sound that grated in Daniel's ears as he stood just outside the double doors. Inside, the board had gathered with homeowners to celebrate what they called a historic victory for Pine Ridge Lake. Through the glass panels, he could see Karen at the head of the long oak table, dressed in a cream blazer, pearls glittering at her throat. She lifted a glass of champagne, her smile practiced and confident, as though she were the architect of some great civic triumph. Behind her, on a projection screen, shone the words, "Future site of the Pine Ridge Community Center." Renderings of sleek modern buildings filled the wall, a pool with glass ceilings, manicured tennis courts, a sparkling clubhouse. The audience clapped, cheering at the promise of progress. To them, the demolition of Daniel's cabin was already old news, reduced to a minor casualty in the march of improvement. Daniel tightened his grip on the folder tucked under his arm, the paper edges worn soft from days of study. He had spent the week in silence, combing through his family's records, every deed, every title, every contract that had been signed across 3 generations. At first he had only sought comfort in the past, clinging to the proof that his family had owned the land longer than the HOA had even existed. But in the process, he discovered something the board had overlooked. Something massive. The land on which the entire Pine Ridge development stood, the glossy lakefront homes, the community center, even the HOA office itself, had been carved decades ago out of a much larger parcel. And that parcel, it had never been sold. It had never changed hands. The Carter family's name remained on the master deed, the legal landlord of the very ground the HOA claimed to control. When Daniel's grandfather leased the land to developers half a century ago, the lease had run its course. No one had bothered to update it. The rights had reverted back. Quietly, legally, inevitably, Daniel now owned the entire stretch of Pine Ridge. The discovery had felt like lightning in his veins, equal parts vindication and fury. For days he kept it close, preparing. He hired a lawyer to double-check the details, who confirmed it with stunned disbelief. Daniel Carter was, in effect, the landlord of the HOA itself. They paid taxes, built homes, and ruled over neighbors on land that was his. And by bulldozing his cabin, they hadn't just destroyed a home, they had violated their landlord's property, opening themselves to lawsuits so devastating they could bankrupt every smug face on the board. Tonight would be the night he showed them. Tonight, they would learn the price of arrogance. The doors to the boardroom creaked open as Daniel stepped inside. Conversations faltered, heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile faltered for the first time in weeks, though she quickly masked it with practiced poise. "Mr. Carter," she said, setting down her glass. "I wasn't expecting you. I assumed you'd moved on." Her tone was casual, dismissive, but Daniel caught the flicker in her eyes, the hint of unease. He walked slowly to the center of the room, each step deliberate, the folder clutched in his hand. He placed it on the table, letting the weight of it thud against the polished wood. "You assumed wrong," he said softly. His voice carried, calm but edged with steel, drawing every gaze toward him. "I've heard a lot these past few weeks about progress," Daniel continued, sweeping his gaze across the board and the crowd. "About sacrifice for the greater good. About vision. And I've watched as you destroyed a home that had stood longer than this HOA has existed. You told me I didn't fit your vision. You laughed when I showed you my deed. But you made one mistake." He flipped open the folder, pulling out crisp documents stamped with seals and signatures. He spread them across the table like cards in a winning hand. "You forgot to check who actually owns the land under your feet." The room went still. Karen's face drained of color as Daniel slid the master deed toward her, tapping the Carter name written in bold script across the top. Gasps rippled through the audience. "This isn't just about my cabin," Daniel said, his voice rising now, steady and controlled but thunderous in the silence. "This entire development, your homes, your community center, your office, sits on property leased decades ago from my family. That lease expired, which means every square foot of Pine Ridge Lake belongs to me." He let the words sink in, the silence heavy and suffocating. Karen reached for the paper, skimming it, her hand trembling slightly as though she wanted to tear it up but knew the futility of such a gesture. The other board members leaned in, pale, their smug grins crumbling into panic. "You bulldozed my cabin," Daniel continued, his tone darker now, heavy with righteous anger. "You trespassed. You destroyed personal property. You violated building laws on land that isn't even yours. Do you know what that means, legally? It means damages. Millions of dollars in damages. It means lawsuits that will gut this HOA and leave every one of you personally liable. You thought you could bully me into silence. But it turns out," he leaned closer, eyes locked on Karen, "you've been answering to me all along." The silence shattered with murmurs and gasps. Neighbors turned to one another, whispering in disbelief. A man in the back laughed nervously. One of the board members stood abruptly, stammering something about calling their lawyer, but his voice broke before he finished. Karen sat frozen, her carefully constructed mask slipping, fear creeping into her features. Daniel gathered the documents back into his folder with deliberate slowness, then straightened. "You wanted progress," he said. "Fine. Here's my vision, accountability, justice, and the end of your little empire." He tucked the folder under his arm and turned toward the doors. The room erupted into chaos behind him, voices shouting, board members scrambling, homeowners demanding answers. But Daniel didn't look back. The balance of power had shifted. The HOA had thought they could bulldoze him into submission. Instead, they had bulldozed themselves into ruin. The storm that broke over Pine Ridge Lake wasn't one of wind and rain. It was legal, financial, and social, and it tore through the HOA with far more force than any thunderclap. Within days of Daniel's reveal, the news spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into headlines in the local paper: HOA illegally bulldozes landlord's cabin, Pine Ridge Board accused of property violations, community leaders face multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Daniel barely had to lift a finger. His lawyer filed the paperwork, but most of the damage was already done by the sheer weight of the truth. The HOA's arrogance had built them a pedestal, but Daniel's documents knocked it out from under them in a single blow. Homeowners, once eager for progress, now turned on the board with fury. The same neighbors who had clapped at Karen's promises now demanded resignations, refunds, and answers. It was chaos in every meeting, with homeowners shouting over one another, and board members sweating as their empire crumbled. Karen tried, at first, to fight back. She stood in front of crowded rooms, waving legal jargon and insisting Daniel's claim was complicated and subject to interpretation. But the confidence that once carried her voice was gone, and the crowd no longer looked at her with admiration. They looked at her with suspicion, anger, even disgust. One by one, her allies on the board abandoned her, resigning in disgrace or simply disappearing from public view. Lawsuits piled up. The county launched an investigation into unauthorized construction on Daniel's land. Even the contractors, once eager to work with the HOA, now backed away nervously, unwilling to be associated with a scandal that could ruin them. By the end of the month, Karen herself faced personal liability for ordering the bulldozing of Daniel's cabin, her name scrawled across court documents in black ink, her empire reduced to a stack of unpaid legal bills. For Daniel, the weeks that followed were a blur of vindication and quiet rage. He attended a handful of hearings, each one reinforcing his rightful ownership of the land. Judges raised eyebrows at the HOA's reckless actions, lawyers whispered in hallways about how unprecedented it was, and every ruling came down in Daniel's favor. He didn't gloat, didn't smile in their faces, but he carried himself with the unshakable calm of a man who had already won. At home, or what was left of it, he spent hours standing at the edge of the rubble, staring at the ruins of his cabin. He sifted through the debris piece by piece, salvaging what little he could, a half-burned photo frame, the iron handle of his grandfather's wood stove, a splinter of the porch railing he had carved his initials into as a boy. He stacked them carefully in boxes, not as evidence, but as memories to be reborn. And slowly, rebirth came. Contractors who had once avoided him began to show up with offers, not from the HOA, but directly to him. Local carpenters, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, volunteered time and resources to help rebuild. Neighbors, ashamed of their silence during the bulldozing, came by with meals, supplies, and even labor. One elderly woman, who had lived in Pine Ridge for 30 years, pressed Daniel's hand and whispered, "We should have stood up for you. We were afraid of them." Not anymore. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something warm cut through the cold stone of anger in his chest. He wasn't alone. The community was still there, and while the HOA had tried to erase his legacy, it had only made it stronger. By the first days of summer, the outline of a new cabin began to rise on the lakefront. Not a replica of the old one, Daniel wanted to honor the past, but not be trapped by it. The new cabin was sturdier, built with modern tools but designed to echo the rustic charm of his grandfather's work. Wide porches faced the lake, logs polished to a golden sheen, windows set to catch the sunrise and the shimmer of water at dusk. Daniel worked alongside the builders every day, sweat soaking his shirt, muscles aching, but his heart full. Each nail he hammered was an act of defiance. Each beam raised a reminder that the land still belonged to him, and always would. Neighbors watched from across the water, some cheering, some still stunned at how completely the tide had turned. Where once the HOA had claimed his cabin was an eyesore, now his rebuild became a symbol of resilience and justice. As for Karen, the last Daniel heard, she had sold her house quietly and moved out of state, her name a bitter aftertaste in every conversation around Pine Ridge. The HOA, stripped of leadership and drowning in lawsuits, dissolved entirely within the year. In its place, the community voted to manage affairs independently, without the chokehold of power-hungry board members. Daniel never sought revenge beyond the courtroom. He didn't need to. The humiliation and collapse of the HOA had been punishment enough. What mattered was the land, the lake, and the cabin rising stronger from the ashes. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the lake glowed orange and red, Daniel sat on the porch of his newly finished cabin. A mug of coffee warmed his hands, though the summer air was mild. The loons called across the water, just as they had when he was a boy, and the scent of fresh pine filled the air. He looked out over the lake, peaceful and unbroken, and felt a weight finally lift from his shoulders. His family's legacy had been bruised, battered, nearly erased, but it had survived. He had survived. And now, the land was his again, untouched by arrogance, protected by the very truth the HOA had ignored. He smiled faintly, sipping his coffee as the last light faded. Justice had been served. The cabin stood once more. And for the first time in a long time, Pine Ridge Lake belonged not to an HOA board, not to petty tyrants with clipboards and threats, but to him.